Every person wants to be part of a story. We know it equally on our best days and on our worst days, at our life's most exceptional moments and in the most mundane. When great and mighty deeds capture our imagination on the theater screen, and then when we walk out the door realizing we have to go to work the next day. When we escape on vacation to marvel at the majesty of the mountains and the wide open plains, and then we remember that all of our bills are waiting for us when we come home. In our moments of inspiration and desperation, we find ourselves confronted with the uniquely human question of purpose, destiny. What are we here for? And what do our lives really mean? From the richest to the poorest man, the need to make our lives purposeful is inescapable and universally propelling. We all see our lives as the unfolding of narrative, our days and weeks, the pages and chapters filled with triumphs and tragedies, and heroes and villains. We always have. Across the centuries and cultures since the dawn of time, we have shared our stories, generation to generation. The odysseys, adventures, and moral greatness of our heroes being the example and aspiration that propels us in moments big and small to greatness in our own time. 2 centuries ago, at the old courthouse in Philadelphia, 55 men stood at a unique vantage point in world history. They looked back upon millennia, from Athens to Rome, and Jerusalem to London, and every city in between. And in the ever-stretching web of history and stories, they heard an equally unique human cry that resounded through the ages, the longing for a meaningful, individual, personal freedom. And they saw in the stories of the Exodus from Egypt and the flight of the pilgrims to Plymouth how the bright hope of every human person for the right to determine their own destiny crept up continually across history amidst the overwhelming ubiquitousness of tyranny and subjugation. And having by the grace of extraordinary divine providence defeated the mightiest empire that the world had ever yet seen, and won for themselves the right to author an entirely new chapter in this grand narrative, the framers of our Constitution laid down the foundation of a new nation, a new people who were not bound by race or religious confession or origin or status or class or wealth or any other immutable characteristic, but by their enshrining belief in the distinct dignity and liberty of every single human person, and the responsibility of every person to strive for the greatest and the noblest good. George Washington said it this way: "In politics as in philosophy, our animating tenets are few and simple, that we be honest and just ourselves, and that we expect this also from others." These first heroes of the American mythos invited every generation that followed to take up the pen and write ever better chapters, new chapters in this story of the greatest adventure that humankind has yet seen. And it has been true for more than 240 years that every generation of Americans has been filled with individuals inspired by the greatness and goodness of our story as a people. From the dinner tables of our homes to the factories in our workplaces and the floors of our offices to the halls of our courthouses and the pews of our churches, at times, when necessary, to the helms of our machines of war. Never on earth has such a simple yet profound creed formed the single unifying thread among people who have come from every tribe and tongue. And this creed has moved great American men and women through the application of our ingenuity and the shedding of our sweat and blood to liberate more people from the clutches of tyrants, slavery, and poverty in our brief history than all the long history of man's relation to man. This, my friends, is our story. This is the great inheritance of our nation, that each of us has the opportunity, if we are willing, to cultivate the personal responsibility, selflessness, and moral character that has elevated generations of Americans above the petty squabbling and tribalism that have long been the ever-present scourge of mankind, and that we can find purpose in pursuing each of our own God-given destiny at peace with one another. The overwhelming benefit of our freedom has always been accompanied by the burden of responsibility, the burden to judge good and evil rightly, to speak the truth at all times, to cultivate personal virtue, to assume the best of our neighbors, to work diligently to provide for ourselves and our families, to foster our curiosity and our ingenuity, and to put them to productive use, to exercise, at times when necessary, our moral, economic, and military might as a people to restrain the malice of tyrants and the suffering that they perpetuate on innocents. When we have shouldered this responsibility, the galvanizing appeal of our American story and the success of our American experiment has so powerfully eliminated the traditional problems of mankind that any remaining problems appear inexcusable and unbearable. And thus, the cynical criticism of today's progressive anti-Americans, whose loud and miserable adherents so amplify these remaining problems that they have us forget all the good our nation has done. They know just as well as we do that utopia is not for this world, but they chafe at the burden of moral responsibility that has otherwise so unified the sense of duty among Americans of every generation. They are more than willing to live in the inertia of all of freedom's benefits, but they are unwilling to personally incur any of the costs to sustain it. Rather than participate in our unifying national legacy, they tell us that we must abandon our national legacy. They are quick to remind us of all of our faults and imperfections, but also quick to forget the high price in measure that we have been willing to pay to make right those imperfections. They tell us that every achievement of our civilization is built upon structures of power and discrimination, and yet they insist we forget or reimagine all of our heroes who overcame discrimination to write it out of our law books forever. They tell us that our own faults destroy any moral authority that we may have to stand up alone if necessary to restrain the evil of tyrants and bullies the world over. They forget the blood of our sons and daughters in the fields of Gettysburg and the sands of Normandy, who gave their lives despite our national imperfections to secure the liberty of their own generation and of millions yet unborn. Tell me then, what nation has so willingly spilled so much of its own blood to absolve itself of the long-standing blight of slavery and to liberate others from its scourge? These critics insist that our long-treasured national institutions are unsalvageable, and instead we must burn them down and remake them in the modern image. They forget the wisdom of Russell Kirk, who reminded us that men cannot improve a society by setting fire to it. They must seek out its old, its noblest, its ancient virtues, and bring them back into the light. They demand with near religious fervor that we bow down to their new idols, while so ironically excoriating our faith in the providence and goodness of God who has thus preserved us a nation. They tell us our heroes were flawed and imperfect, and thus they ought to be disowned and discarded. They forget that in disowning the legacy of our ancestors, we also disinherit all of our children. They tell us we must abandon our long history of individual aspirations for a free and adventuresome life, in exchange for a counterfeit, a story instead of cynicism, of perpetual dependence, of subjection to their ivory tower benevolence. I think that you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in their heart of hearts who would exchange such promise for such despondency. Sir Winston Churchill reminded us that the truth is the most valuable thing in the world. It is so valuable, it is often surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. However powerful this new cultural hegemony may seem, it holds no sway over the truth that has always promised to set us free, no matter how obscured it may seem in our day. You and I know in our hearts the truth that America is a great nation because it is a good nation. We know that the truth of the accomplishments of our national heroes have inspired not just Americans, but citizens of every nation who have seen the words of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Reagan tear down their own iron curtains. We know the truth that the promise of American adventure is alive and well because it dwells in the moral courage of our people, and no one can take that away. We know that there are pages yet to be written in this great story of ours, that our brightest days might remain ahead not because we abandon and replace our heritage, but because we seize upon it. As Joshua reminded the people of Israel, it is our time to choose this day whom we will serve. Let us then, in confidence, renew our strength and remind our fellow Americans that the invitation still stands from the founding generation to ours today, to participate in the writing of the next chapters of this greatest adventure that the human heart has ever seen. It's time to saddle up our horses. We've got a trail to blaze through the wild blue yonder of God's amazing grace. And let's follow our leader into this glorious unknown. This is the life like no other. This is the great adventure. May God bless the United States of America. Thank you.